Standing on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo received reports of the Pearl Harbor attack unfolding 230 miles southeast at 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941. Six Japanese carriers had launched 353 aircraft in two waves, achieving complete surprise against the American Pacific Fleet. Battleships were burning. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. American naval power in the Pacific was crippled in a single morning. Nagumo's staff officers celebrated the overwhelming success. Commander Minoru Genda, the attack's principal planner, tallied the results. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, 3 cruisers hit, 3 destroyers damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed. American casualties exceeded 2,400 dead. Japanese losses were minimal, 29 aircraft and fewer than 70 men. The attack had succeeded beyond optimistic projections. But Nagumo, studying the intelligence reports carefully, noticed something disturbing. The American carriers were absent. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. The 3 carriers that represented America's ability to project power across the Pacific had escaped untouched. His staff dismissed this concern. Carriers were important, they agreed, but battleships were the true measure of naval power. With America's battle fleet crippled, Japan controlled the Pacific. What Nagumo couldn't have known, what no Japanese officer could have imagined, was that Pearl Harbor had taught America exactly the wrong lesson from Japan's perspective. The United States would not rebuild its battleship fleet to challenge Japan in traditional surface combat. Instead, America would build carriers in numbers that would overwhelm Japanese naval aviation through sheer industrial capacity. Within 3 years, a single class of American carrier would outnumber the entire Japanese carrier fleet. The Essex-Class would transform the Pacific War from a contest between roughly equal forces into an industrial massacre. The story begins not with military planning but with industrial foresight. In 1939, as war consumed Europe, Congress authorized construction of a new class of fleet carriers designed to overcome the limitations of previous American designs. The Yorktown-class carriers, America's most modern vessels, displaced 20,000 tons and operated approximately 80 aircraft. They were good ships, but treaty limitations had constrained their design. With treaties expiring, the Navy could finally build carriers without restriction. The Essex-class design incorporated lessons from early carrier operations and anticipated future requirements. Displacement was set at 27,100 tons standard, making them 35% larger than the Yorktowns. This extra size translated to increased aircraft capacity, improved armor protection, enhanced anti-aircraft armament, and greater fuel and ammunition storage. The flight deck measured 862 feet long and 108 feet wide, providing ample space for aircraft operations. The hangar deck could accommodate 90 aircraft with wings folded, though operational airgroups typically numbered 70 to 80 aircraft. This was 50% more than Japanese carriers of equivalent size, reflecting American design philosophy that prioritized aircraft capacity over other considerations. The Japanese built carriers with smaller airgroups but better armor and damage control. The Americans built carriers that were essentially floating aircraft warehouses. Propulsion came from 8 boilers feeding 4 steam turbines generating 150,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 propellers to achieve a maximum speed of 33 knots. Range was 20,000 nautical miles at 15 knots, sufficient to cross the Pacific multiple times without refueling. This endurance was critical for campaigns conducted thousands of miles from American bases. Japanese carriers, designed for operations closer to home waters, couldn't match this range. Armor protection was concentrated on vital areas. The flight deck was 1.5 inches of special treatment steel over 3 inches of teak wood designed to absorb bomb hits. The hangar deck sides were 2.5 to 4 inches of armor. The magazines and machinery spaces had 4-inch side armor and 1.5-inch deck armor. This was lighter than battleship armor, but sufficient to resist hits from bombs and shells that would cripple unarmored carriers. Anti-aircraft armament was comprehensive and would grow throughout the war. Initial loadout included 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns in single mounts, 32 40 Bofors guns in quadruple mounts, and 46 20 Oerlikon cannons. By 1945, some Essex carriers mounted over 100 anti-aircraft weapons of various calibers, creating a defensive umbrella that made attacking them suicidal for enemy aircraft. The first Essex-Class keel was laid at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The Navy had ordered 4 ships initially, expecting them to join the fleet in 1944 or 1945 to replace aging carriers from the 1920s. Pearl Harbor transformed this leisurely construction schedule into desperate urgency. Additional orders came immediately. More yards began building Essex-class carriers. The target shifted from supplementing the existing fleet to creating an entirely new fleet that would overwhelm Japan through numbers. USS Essex, the class's namesake, was commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 1 year and 24 days after Pearl Harbor. This construction time, from keel laying to commissioning, was just 20 months. For comparison, Japanese carriers typically required 36 months from keel to commissioning. American yards were building fleet carriers faster than Japan-built destroyers. The construction process revealed American industrial advantages. Newport News Shipbuilding employed techniques borrowed from automotive mass production. Subassemblies were built in separate workshops, then moved to the shipway for final assembly. This allowed multiple work crews to operate simultaneously without interfering with each other. Welding replaced riveting wherever possible, reducing man-hours and construction time. Standardized components meant that any Essex could accept parts intended for any other Essex, simplifying logistics. By mid-1943, 9 shipyards were building Essex-class carriers simultaneously. Newport News had 2 ways building Essexes. Brooklyn Navy Yard was building 2. Philadelphia Navy Yard was building 1. The speed of construction shocked Japanese intelligence when they finally understood the scope of American building programs. Japan's entire wartime carrier construction would total 17 ships of all types. America would commission 24 Essex-class carriers alone, plus numerous light carriers and escort carriers. The first Essex-class carrier to see combat was USS Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway. She departed Pearl Harbor in May 1943 as flagship of Task Force 58, demonstrating immediately the capabilities that would define the class. Her air group of 91 aircraft struck Marcus Island on August 31, 1943, proving that a single Essex could deliver more striking power than the entire Japanese carrier force at Pearl Harbor. USS Essex herself entered combat in September 1943 during operations against Marcus and Wake Islands. The strikes validated the design philosophy. The large flight deck allowed rapid launch and recovery cycles. The spacious hangar deck enabled quick aircraft maintenance. The comprehensive anti-aircraft armament drove off Japanese counterattacks. Most importantly, the ships proved mechanically reliable, operating for weeks without requiring yard time for repairs. By November 1943, 6 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific. This already exceeded Japan's entire frontline carrier strength. The Battle of Tarawa, America's first major amphibious assault in the Central Pacific, saw 5 Essex carriers providing air cover. They launched over 2,000 sorties in 4 days, a tempo that exhausted Japanese defenders and prevented reinforcement. Japanese forces on Tarawa had no effective answer to this concentration of naval aviation. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain carrier operations after catastrophic losses at Midway, Coral Sea, and the Solomons Campaign. The 6 carriers lost in 1942 represented half of Japan's pre-war carrier strength. Worse than ship losses were aircrew casualties. Japanese naval aviation had entered the war with superbly trained pilots who had years of experience. By 1943, most were dead, and their replacements received minimal training due to fuel shortages and lack of aircraft. American naval aviation followed the opposite trajectory. The pilots flying from Essex carriers in 1943 were better trained than those who fought at Midway. Training programs expanded to produce 30,000 pilots annually by 1943. Each pilot received 300 hours of flight time before entering combat, plus weeks of carrier qualification training. Fuel was unlimited. Training aircraft were abundant. Accidents were tolerated as the inevitable cost of creating effective combat pilots. The Essex Air Groups reflected this training advantage. Fighter squadrons flew F-6F Hellcats, designed specifically to defeat the famous Zero fighter. Dive bomber squadrons operated as B-2C Heldovers carrying 1,000-pound bombs. Torpedo squadrons flew TBF Avengers carrying torpedoes or bombs. Each aircraft type was superior to its Japanese equivalent, and the pilots were better trained. Combined with the numerical advantage of operating from multiple carriers, this created overwhelming combat power. Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, demonstrated what concentrated Essex-Class carrier power meant for amphibious operations. The carriers maintained continuous air cover over the invasion beaches, shot down Japanese aircraft attempting to attack the fleet, and struck Japanese positions with precision that amazed ground commanders. Marines landing at Tarawa faced fierce resistance, but never worried about Japanese air attack. The Essex carriers had established complete air superiority. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, commanding Japanese naval air forces in the region, reported to combined fleet headquarters that opposing American carrier operations was impossible with available forces. The Americans, he wrote, could maintain constant combat air patrols while simultaneously launching strikes. Japanese carriers with smaller air groups had to choose between defense and offense. They couldn't do both effectively. The Essex carriers, with their 90 aircraft air groups, could do both simultaneously. By January 1944, 9 Essex-class carriers were operational. They formed the nucleus of Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force that would dominate the Pacific for the remainder of the war. Commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, Task Force 58 operated as a mobile air base capable of projecting power across thousands of miles. The Essex carriers, with their exceptional range and reliability, allowed Mitcher to strike targets that Japanese commanders considered beyond American reach. Operation Hailstone, the attack on Truk Lagoon in February 1944, proved this capability. Truk was Japan's main forward base, heavily defended and considered impregnable. Task Force 58, built around 9 carriers including 6 Essex-class vessels, struck Truk with over 1,200 sorties in 2 days. They destroyed 270 Japanese aircraft, sank 50 merchant ships and auxiliaries, and effectively neutralized Truk as a naval base. The Japanese fleet abandoned Truk immediately, recognizing it was no longer safe from American carrier strikes. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was devastating. Truk had been their Pearl Harbor, the anchorage where the combined fleet could rest and refit secure from American attack. The Essex carriers had reached Truk and destroyed it with impunity. If Truk wasn't safe, nowhere was safe. The Japanese Navy was being pushed back to home waters not by superior strategy, but by overwhelming material superiority that they had no means of countering. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would conclusively demonstrate Essex-class carrier dominance. The Japanese Navy, committing its remaining carrier strength to stop the American invasion of Saipan, assembled 9 carriers operating 473 aircraft. This represented virtually every operational carrier and trained pilot Japan possessed. Opposing them was Task Force 58 with 15 carriers, including 8 Essex-Class vessels, operating 956 aircraft. The Americans had twice as many carriers and twice as many aircraft, and both carriers and aircraft were superior qualitatively. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force, understood the odds were poor, but believed he had tactical advantages. Japanese aircraft had longer range, allowing them to strike American carriers from beyond American strike range. He could also use land-based aircraft from Guam to attack American ships, coordinating with his carrier aircraft for overwhelming strikes. The plan was sound in theory. In practice, it resulted in the greatest carrier-based defeat in naval history. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched 4 successive strikes totaling 373 aircraft against the American fleet. The Essex carriers launched their Hellcat fighters to intercept. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots massacred Japanese attackers. The Essex carriers' radar detected incoming raids at long range, allowing fighters to intercept at optimal altitude and position. Japanese pilots, poorly trained and flying inferior aircraft, had no chance. The results were catastrophic for Japan. Of 373 attacking aircraft, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 330. The Essex carriers' comprehensive anti-aircraft armament drove off survivors without suffering significant damage. Only 30 Japanese aircraft returned to their carriers. Simultaneously, American submarines sank 2 Japanese carriers. By evening, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The following day, American carriers launched a long-range strike that sank another Japanese carrier and damaged others. The Battle of the Philippine Sea cost Japan 3 carriers, approximately 600 aircraft, and irreplaceable experienced pilots. American losses were 123 aircraft, mostly from operational accidents during night recoveries, and minimal damage to ships. The Essex carriers had destroyed Japanese naval aviation in 2 days of combat. The battle demonstrated multiple Essex-class advantages. The radar-equipped combat air patrols could intercept raids before they reached the fleet. The massive air groups could maintain continuous patrols while launching strikes. The extensive anti-aircraft armament engaged any aircraft that penetrated fighter cover. The armor protection limited damage when Japanese aircraft did hit. And most importantly, there were so many Essex carriers that losing 1 or 2 wouldn't significantly reduce American combat power. Ozawa, reporting the disaster to Combined Fleet Headquarters, was blunt in his assessment. The Americans, he stated, had achieved qualitative and quantitative superiority that Japan couldn't overcome. Their carriers were more capable, their aircraft were superior, their pilots were better trained, and they had overwhelming numbers. Continuing to commit carriers to combat would simply result in their destruction with no possibility of meaningful success. The Japanese carrier force was finished as an offensive weapon. By September 1944, 15 Essex-class carriers were operational. Task Force 58 had become Task Force 38 as operational control shifted between different admirals, but the composition remained centered on the Essex carriers. They ranged across the Pacific, striking targets from Okinawa to the Philippines to Formosa. Japanese commanders could no longer predict where American carriers would appear, only that when they appeared, the result would be devastating. The invasion of the Philippines in October 1944 saw 17 American carriers, including 12 Essex-class vessels, supporting the landings. The Japanese Navy, committing its remaining strength in a desperate attempt to destroy the invasion fleet, launched Operation Shogo. This complex plan involved using remaining carriers as decoys to draw American carriers away, while battleships and cruisers attacked the invasion beaches. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, spanning 4 days in October 1944, became the largest naval battle in history. The Essex carriers played decisive roles in multiple engagements. When Admiral William Halsey took Task Force 38 north to pursue the Japanese carrier decoy force, 8 Essex carriers provided the striking power that sank 4 Japanese carriers. Meanwhile, escort carriers, smaller vessels derived from merchant hulls, held off Japanese battleships attacking the invasion beaches. The Japanese carriers used as decoys in Operation Shogo were essentially empty. They operated fewer than 100 aircraft total across 4 carriers because Japan had no trained pilots to put aboard them. The carriers that had terrorized the Pacific in early 1942 had been reduced to bait, their air groups destroyed, their function reduced to drawing American attention, while other forces attempted actual attacks. The Essex carriers sank them efficiently, requiring only minutes to overwhelm defenses that barely existed. By December 1944, the Essex carriers faced a new threat: kamikazes. Japanese commanders, recognizing that conventional attacks couldn't penetrate American defenses, ordered suicide attacks. Pilots with minimal training would crash aircraft loaded with explosives into American ships. The tactic was desperate, wasteful, and initially effective. Kamikazes damaged several Essex carriers, though none were sunk, demonstrating that armor and damage control systems could survive hits that would have destroyed earlier American carriers. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs on March 19, 1945, while operating off Japan. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft on the hangar deck. The resulting fires killed 724 crew members and nearly sank the ship. But Franklin's damage control parties contained the fires, counter-flooding prevented capsizing, and the ship returned to the United States under her own power. This survival, after damage that would have destroyed any other carrier afloat, testified to the structural integrity and damage control design incorporated into the Essex-Class. USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, causing massive fires and 389 deaths. Again, damage control parties saved the ship. She didn't sink, didn't capsize, and eventually returned to port. These attacks demonstrated both kamikaze effectiveness and Essex-class toughness. The carriers could be damaged, but proved extremely difficult to sink, allowing them to remain operational despite taking hits that would have put earlier carriers on the bottom. By May 1945, 17 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific. They had participated in every major operation since Tarawa. They had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese ships. They had destroyed thousands of Japanese aircraft. They had supported every amphibious landing from the Gilberts to Okinawa, and American shipyards were still building more. 4 additional Essex carriers would commission before war's end, though they arrived too late for combat. The contrast with Japanese carrier construction was stark. Japan commissioned 7 carriers during the war years, most of them converted from other vessels. Training carriers, escort carriers, converted battleships, desperate expedients to replace combat losses. By 1945, Japan's carrier fleet was effectively non-existent. Ships existed but sat in port without fuel, without aircraft, without trained pilots. The carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor had been annihilated, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to rebuild it. American industrial capacity had produced 24 Essex-class carriers in under 4 years, from keel laying to combat deployment. For comparison, this was more fleet carriers than Japan built in its entire naval history from 1920 to 1945. The numbers revealed the fundamental imbalance that Pearl Harbor had obscured. Japan could win battles through superior tactics and training. America would win the war through superior production and logistics. The Essex carriers represented more than individual ships. They were the visible manifestation of American industrial power applied to military problems. Each carrier required 25,000 tons of steel, 4,000 tons of armor, engines totaling 150,000 horsepower, and millions of components ranging from sophisticated radar systems to simple plumbing fixtures. Building them required coordinating suppliers across the country, training thousands of shipyard workers, and solving unprecedented engineering challenges. The aircraft aboard them told a similar story. Grumman built over 12,000 F-6F Hellcats during the war. Chance Vought produced over 12,000 F-4U Corsairs. Eastern Aircraft, a division of General Motors, built over 7,500 FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers. American factories produced more carrier aircraft in 1944 alone than Japan built during the entire war. The Essex carriers provided the platforms for this aerial armada, and together they swept Japanese aviation from the Pacific Seas. The pilots flying from Essex carriers in 1945 were the best-trained naval aviators in the world. By war's end, American training programs had produced over 60,000 naval aviators. Losses, though significant, were continuously replaced by fresh pilots from training commands that operated with unlimited fuel, abundant aircraft, and experienced instructors rotated home from combat. Japanese training programs, crippled by fuel shortages and lack of aircraft, produced inadequately trained pilots in insufficient numbers. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying from Essex herself, became the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed kills. His success exemplified the system supporting Essex operations. He flew a superior fighter, maintained by skilled mechanics, armed with reliable weapons, directed by radar controllers, and supported by unlimited replacements for aircraft and pilots lost in combat. Japanese aces might achieve impressive kill ratios, but they flew inferior aircraft, lacked radar direction, received minimal maintenance, and once lost, couldn't be replaced. The final months of the war saw Essex carriers operating off Japan with impunity, striking targets that had been beyond American reach 3 years earlier. They ranged along the coast, hitting ports, airfields, and infrastructure. Japanese defenders could offer only token resistance. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Remaining pilots had minimal training. Anti-aircraft ammunition was rationed. The empire that had begun the war with the world's most capable carrier force was being systematically destroyed by carriers they hadn't believed America could build. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet in the war's final months, acknowledged in messages to Imperial headquarters that opposing American carrier operations was impossible with available resources. The Americans, he reported, operated carriers in numbers that allowed them to maintain continuous presence. When one carrier task force withdrew to rearm and refuel, another appeared. Japan had no counter to this sustained pressure, no means of rebuilding carrier strength, and no hope of changing the strategic situation through naval action. The atomic bombs dropped in August 1945 ended the war before the planned invasion of Japan. The Essex carriers were assigned crucial roles in Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion. They would have provided air cover for the largest amphibious operation in history, launched strikes against Japanese defenses, and intercepted kamikaze attacks. Their ability to maintain air superiority over the invasion beaches was considered essential to the operation's success. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, 17 Essex-Class carriers were in the Pacific. They had participated in virtually every significant operation in the theater. They had launched over 620,000 individual aircraft sorties. They had destroyed over 10,000 enemy aircraft in combat. They had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese vessels. They had supported amphibious operations from Tarawa to Okinawa. And not one Essex carrier had been sunk, though several had been severely damaged. This survival rate, unprecedented for warships engaged in continuous combat for 2 years, reflected the design philosophy behind the Essex-Class. They were tough enough to absorb damage that would sink lesser ships. They had sufficient redundancy in systems that damage to one section didn't cripple the ship. They had comprehensive damage control equipment and trained crews who could contain fires and flooding. They were built to take punishment and keep fighting, exactly what modern naval combat required. The cost of building this fleet was staggering. Each Essex carrier cost approximately $78 million in 1940s dollars, equivalent to roughly $1.4 billion today. 24 ships represented nearly $2 billion 1940s dollars, or about $34 billion in modern terms. Add the aircraft, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, the training programs, and the true cost exceeded calculation. But America possessed both the industrial capacity to build this fleet and the financial resources to sustain it throughout the war. Japan, attempting to match American carrier production, bankrupted itself. By 1944, Japan was spending 68% of national income on the military, unsustainable for any length of time. The economy was collapsing, industry was being destroyed by American bombing, and raw materials were unavailable due to submarine interdiction. Building carriers required resources Japan no longer had and couldn't acquire. The industrial competition had been lost before it began. Post-war analysis by American naval officers concluded that the Essex carriers were the most significant weapons system in the Pacific theater. Strategic bombing contributed to victory. Submarines destroyed Japanese commerce. Ground forces conquered territory. But the Essex carriers provided the mobile striking power that enabled all other operations. Without them, invading Japanese-held islands would have been impossible. Without them, maintaining air superiority would have been impossible. Without them, victory would have required years longer and cost vastly more casualties. Japanese naval officers, interrogated after surrender, consistently cited American carrier strength as the decisive factor in their defeat. Individual battles might have been lost through tactical errors or bad luck, but the strategic situation was hopeless from 1943 onward because American carriers appeared in overwhelming numbers that Japan couldn't match. Every Japanese carrier lost was irreplaceable. Every American carrier lost was replaced by two more. This mathematics of industrial attrition, not tactical brilliance, determined the war's outcome. The Essex-Class carriers served long after World War II. Several were modernized with angled flight decks, steam catapults, and other improvements, serving into the 1970s. USS Lexington, commissioned in 1943, served as a training carrier until 1991, making her the longest-serving carrier in American history. USS Hornet recovered the Apollo 11 astronauts in 1969. USS Intrepid became a museum ship in New York. The ships that won the Pacific War continued serving America for decades after victory. But the Essex legacy transcends the individual ships. They established the template for American naval power that continues today. Modern American carriers are direct descendants of the Essex design philosophy. Large hulls carrying numerous aircraft, comprehensive defensive systems, sufficient armor to survive damage, and mechanical reliability enabling sustained operations. The supercarriers of today's fleet are Essex carriers scaled up and modernized, but the fundamental concepts remain unchanged. The Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific for 6 months after Pearl Harbor. From December 1941 through May 1942, Japanese carriers operated with near impunity, striking targets across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. They sank British battleships off Malaya, raided the Indian Ocean, and threatened Australia. Japanese naval officers believed they had achieved decisive superiority that America couldn't challenge. Then came Midway, and the illusion shattered. But even after Midway, even after losing 4 carriers, Japan maintained rough parity in carrier strength through early 1943. The turning point wasn't a battle. It was the arrival of the first Essex-class carriers in overwhelming numbers. When 1 Essex appeared, Japanese commanders could adapt. When 3 appeared, they could consolidate forces. When 6 appeared simultaneously, overwhelming force from multiple directions, adaptation became impossible. By 1944, with a dozen Essex carriers operational, Japanese naval aviation was fighting for survival, not victory. The fundamental lesson of the Essex-Class is that industrial capacity matters more than individual capability in extended conflicts. Each Essex carrier was good, not great. Japanese carriers had better armor. British carriers had armored flight decks. But America built 24 Essex carriers while Japan built 7 new carriers total and Britain built 6 fleet carriers. The adequate ship produced in overwhelming numbers defeated the superior ship produced in inadequate quantities. This lesson shapes military procurement today. Armies don't seek the perfect weapon. They seek the good enough weapon that can be produced, maintained, and replaced at scale. Navies don't design ships to win individual engagements. They design ships that can be built in numbers sufficient to maintain continuous presence. Air forces don't demand aircraft with maximum capability. They demand aircraft with sufficient capability to accomplish missions in quantity that overwhelms opponents. The Essex-class carriers demonstrated these principles with brutal clarity. Japanese carriers were magnificent individually, operated by skilled crews, launching attacks executed with precision. But there were never enough of them, and losses couldn't be replaced. The Essex carriers were good individually, operated by well-trained crews, launching attacks with overwhelming force. And there were dozens of them with more arriving constantly, and losses replaced within weeks. The Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific until Essex-class carriers arrived by the dozen. Then the rule ended, not through tactical defeat but through industrial annihilation. Japanese carriers were sunk, their aircraft destroyed, their pilots killed, and nothing appeared to replace them. American carriers multiplied, their losses replaced, their air groups refreshed, their operations intensified. By 1945, the carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor was a memory, destroyed by ships that didn't exist when the war began. This is the legacy of the Essex-class. 24 fleet carriers built in 4 years, participating in every major Pacific operation, losing not one ship to enemy action despite years of combat, enabling victory through industrial capacity that Japan couldn't match and never imagined America possessed. The Japanese Navy ruled the Pacific for 6 months. The Essex carriers ruled it for 3 years, and their descendants rule it still today, testament to the enduring effectiveness of the design philosophy that created them. Good enough, in overwhelming numbers, supported by unmatched logistics, defeating superior individual capabilities through systematic superiority.